So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case, a very highly requested case of mine. Today we're going to Wales in the UK, South Wales specifically, and we're going to be taking a look at a harrowing massacre that wiped out 3 generations of the same family, known as the Clydach Murders. This case is going to be a 2-parter, so this is part 1. Part 2 will be out in the next few days. Make sure you've got my notifications on for my channel so you don't miss it. But before we get into this case, I just want to thank our sponsor for this video, Audible. I'm sure you guys have already heard of Audible. Who hasn't at this point? They are the world's leading provider of audiobooks. I've used them for years. Audible subscribers receive 1 credit per month to spend on any title in the whole of Audible's library, plus unlimited Audible originals. They also have a bunch of extras as well. It's not just audiobooks. They have podcasts, they have daily news reads, they have guided meditation. And Audible are doing so much to help with the current state of the world with COVID-19. Everyone's lives are just being shaken up. Kids are out of their daily routine, they're out of school. Everyone's a lot more anxious. And so to help with that, Audible have launched stories.audible.com, where anyone, anywhere in the world can stream hundreds of titles for free, no sign up required. There's books for all ages in so many different languages. There's something for everyone. I was going to try and give you one good recommendation from the main library on Audible, but I have so many. I use their audiobooks so much in my research as well if there's books relating to the case. For example, for this case, I used The Clydach Murders, which is by John Morris. I listened to that whole thing. It's like 11 hours long. I recently listened to Inside the Mind of BTK, which is about Dennis Rader, the blind torture kill guy, and it's made me want to do a video on the BTK killer so bad. I personally love using Audible to listen to audiobooks as I'm cleaning or doing my makeup because that's already a huge chunk of my day that I can't do anything else. So I like to kind of multitask and make it productive at the same time. So if you want to get your first audiobook plus unlimited Audible originals for free when you try Audible for 30 days, you can go through my link, which is audible.com/Eleanor, or you can text Eleanor to 500 500. Thanks again to Audible for sponsoring this video. I'm really excited about this sponsorship. But before we get into this case, I just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. Just a quick warning before we do get into it, this case does involve themes of sexual assault, so if that's something that you don't want to hear about, feel free to click out of this video. I'll be back very soon with a different case. So, like I said, this case takes place in Wales, specifically, believe it or not, a town called Clydach, which is just a little bit north of Swansea in the south of Wales. I think it's actually a village. I don't think it's a town. Clydach village. Also, if I'm butchering the pronunciation of any Welsh locations in this video, I do apologise right now. I've done my best to try to research how things are pronounced, but the Welsh accent and the Welsh language is something that's always baffled my brain. So Amanda Power, better known as Mandy Power, was a 34-year-old nurse from South Wales. As a young girl aged just 16, Mandy met the man of her dreams that would later become her husband, Michael Power, and the two of them married when she was just in her early 20s. Michael was a baker, and like I said, Mandy was a nurse, and even though the two of them were very talented in their careers, they were very devoted to their life path. They didn't quite earn enough money to start the rest of their life, to buy a house together and start a family together. So shortly after their marriage, they decided to move in with Mandy's mother, Doris Dawson, and they were just going to live there for a while until they saved up the money to buy their own house and start their own life. Mandy's mother, Doris Dawson, was almost in her 70s at this point, and she was very loved in Clydach. She just had this reputation as such a wonderful woman. Everyone loved her, and then by default they loved Mandy because that was her daughter. I mean, Mandy was loved in her own right as well, but this was Doris's kid. If you love Doris, you love her daughter. Anyway, Mandy and Michael moved in with Doris. They began saving up their money and they were getting to a decent place. They weren't quite ready to move out yet, but then, rather unexpectedly, Mandy fell pregnant. The two of them had always wanted children together. They'd always wanted a family. And, you know, this wasn't quite when they'd expected to have them, but she fell pregnant. They nearly had enough money to buy a house, and so they thought, oh, let's just start our family early. Mandy gave birth to a beautiful baby girl that they named Katie, and the three of them all moved into their own home, and shortly after the move, Mandy fell pregnant again and gave birth to Emily 2 years later. So now the couple had 2 daughters. Everything was going well for a while. The family were very happy. They were starting this life that they'd always wanted. However, after a few years, Michael Power decided that he no longer wanted this. He didn't want this family that he'd created. He just felt that this life wasn't for him. He'd made a mistake somewhere. There were rumours of Mandy having an affair with a local taxi driver, but I don't know if that's 100% accurate, and I don't want to sit here and accuse someone of that when I don't have the facts. So it's uncertain why the two of them broke up specifically or what led to their breakup. Only they knew. However, Michael Power did end up getting a divorce from Mandy, and the two of them went their separate ways. Michael Power ended up moving on. He found a new girlfriend. He left Mandy with full custody of the children, but he was still in their life. He did still, buy them things, pay child support, and see them often. Like, he wasn't a deadbeat father by any means. He was still in his family's life. It just wasn't what he wanted anymore. And now Mandy was left in that big home that they bought together. I mean, I don't think it was that big, but it was too big for her to afford all by herself now. She had one paycheck, her nurse's paycheck. She had to pay for herself and her 2 daughters. She just didn't have the money anymore. And at this point, it was the mid-1990s, and Mandy's mother, Doris, who was now in her mid-70s, had suffered a pretty bad brain hemorrhage, and she was left needing constant care. She needed to live with someone. She couldn't live by herself. And so these two circumstances combined, Mandy not having enough money to pay for herself and her children, and Doris needing constant care, meant that it only made sense if they all moved in together, and it was Doris, Mandy, Katie and Emily from that moment forward. They bought a semi-detached house on Kelvin Road in Clydach, 9 Kelvin Road, and they were happy there. Mandy was caring for her 2 children, she was caring for her mother, she still had the same job. However, it got to a point where she began feeling like she didn't have a life outside of that, outside of her family. She was constantly caring for other people that she was forgetting to care for herself and have a social life. So Mandy Power decided to try get back in the dating game a little bit. She began seeing different men here and there. She saw a neighbour for a little bit. They went on a couple of dates. She started an affair with a taxi driver. There were a couple of different men, but none of them really, swept her off her feet enough for them to become long term. And Mandy knew that she wanted more than just a man in her social life. She wanted friends. She wanted, a group of girls. So in an attempt to kind of find her circle of platonic friends, she decided to go out and join a women's rugby team because she'd always been interested in sport. She'd always been good at it, but of course, having 2 children, having to care for a mother, she hadn't enjoyed it for a while. So she joins this rugby team, and there she meets a woman named Alison Lewis, who quickly became her best friend. They were so close. They spent so much time together. Alison Lewis was a former police officer. She'd actually had to quit the police force due to mental health issues. She didn't have a job at the time when she met Mandy. Alison was just kind of trying to get herself back on the right track, trying to look after her mind. She was actually doing the same thing that Mandy was doing by joining this rugby club. She joined to make friends and have a bit more of a social life. Between 1998 and 1999, Alison and Mandy became inseparable. They were always together. They were always inviting each other to different things. Alison had a whole family. She had children and a husband. She would always invite Mandy to their kind of get-togethers. But all of this would come to a sudden end on June 27th, 1997 at 4:27 a.m. when police received the first of many frantic phone calls from Kelvin Road informing them of a house fire on the street. The fire was at that semi-detached house, 9 Kelvin Road, and so firefighters, paramedics, police all rushed to the scene. They had a quick run around the house to assess the scene, and they noticed that the main blaze seemed to be coming from the kitchen, although the house was pretty badly burnt at this point. It seemed very badly damaged, even from the outside, so who knows what it was like on the inside. The whole house was up in flames. I know I said the kitchen was the worst of it, but there was fire in every window, smoke coming out of every window. As the firefighters began trying to put this house fire out, neighbours from Kelvin Road were congregating outside. Obviously, all of this commotion outside had woken everyone up and they were coming out to see what was going on. Neighbours called Mandy's sister, who was there within minutes. She lived very close by, and this was around 5 in the morning at this point, and as soon as Mandy's sister arrived, she just broke down. She didn't know if any of them were still in there. This was her mother, her sister, her 2 nieces. She didn't know if they were injured, if they were even alive at this point. Neighbours informed the firefighters that they believed that everyone that occupied that house was still in there that night, and that it was 4 girls, 2 women and 2 children. As soon as the fire was extinguished, firefighters ran straight into the house to try to find all 4 of them, while paramedics set up on the grass outside the house all like oxygen tanks and masks, because the fire was so bad that they didn't think they were going to get anyone out conscious. They thought if they weren't so badly injured that they'd passed out, they would probably have passed out from smoke inhalation. So firefighters crawled up the stairs. They had to keep as low as they possibly could to make sure that they didn't pass out from smoke inhalation. Of course, they have all this gear, but they still had to crawl to get places. They went straight up the stairs, and when they got to the top of the stairs, the first firefighter began swiping his hand across the landing to see if he could feel anyone, and that was when he felt the first victim, 10-year-old Katie. And so they grabbed Katie. It seemed as though she was passed out at this point. She was just laid on the landing. They grabbed her and carried her outside onto the grass. She was the first of the family recovered. As Katie's body was being passed outside, the rest of the firefighters continued to crawl upstairs, and they went into the first room, which was Katie and Emily's bedroom. And there they found 8-year-old Emily. She too was also passed out. Her body was also carried outside and laid out on the grass. So now both girls were out there as paramedics were trying to attach the masks and perform CPR on them to try to resuscitate them. The next victim firefighters came across was found in Doris Dawson's bedroom, but it was actually Mandy Power. She was found naked at the time, also unconscious, and so her body was carried out and laid on the grass by her daughters to be resuscitated. Paramedics quickly noticed, as they were trying to perform CPR, that there was blood on all the girls. It seemed as though maybe they'd tried to escape and they'd maybe hit their head or something. Maybe they'd injured themselves trying to get out of this house fire. But paramedics weren't really focusing on that right now. Their main focus was trying to resuscitate these 3 girls. They thought it was odd, but they thought that, them trying to get out and getting injured in the process was the most reasonable explanation for this blood. After some attempts to resuscitate the 3 of them, paramedics were trying their hardest, but it was just too late. It seemed as though all 3 of them were probably already dead when they were carried out of the house. And so Mandy Power and her 2 children, Katie and Emily, were all pronounced dead at the scene. Now that the smoke had cleared inside the house, firefighters went back in to see if they could find their 4th victim, Doris Dawson, and they found her deceased, lying in her bed. They checked her pulse, and it was clear that there was nothing that they could do. There was no point trying to carry her out to the garden. Instead, they thought they would just leave her there in bed until the coroners got there to properly remove her body from the scene. A lot of the people on site that day, firefighters, paramedics, police officers, neighbours, were so affected by this. This was such a harrowing scene. 3 generations of the same family all wiped out in one blaze. 2 young girls that had their whole lives ahead of them, a loving mother, a doting grandmother. Even if people didn't know the Power family personally, they still shared their family's sorrow, because this could have been anyone. This could have been anyone's family, anyone's mother, anyone's grandmother. It was actually one of the women police officers that broke the news of the family's death to Mandy's sister. Her sister was just saying, "No, please tell me they're not dead," and this police officer just started crying, and she said, "I'm so sorry, they're gone." Once paramedics had given up trying to resuscitate the victims and it was clear that they were already gone, they began inspecting these injuries, where all the blood had come from, because it was actually kind of hard for them to get the oxygen masks on the victims' heads because there was so much blood and injuries on their heads. Especially on one of the young girls, they were trying to get this mask on, but they couldn't get it on evenly because it seemed as though her head was disfigured from these injuries. And quickly, paramedics realised that yes, all 4 of these victims had been dead for a short while before they were recovered, but the fire hadn't been the cause of their death. It seemed as though all 4 of them, even Doris Dawson, whose body was still in the house, still in her bed, had died from serious head injuries. It seemed as though they'd all been beaten to death. The bodies were taken for an autopsy, and it was quickly confirmed that their cause of death had been bludgeoning. All 4 of them had been murdered, beaten over the head, with different severities, some more than others. Based on the victims' injuries, the pathologist theorised that the murder weapon used had been a long, heavy pole, and it was used with so much force that it had actually smashed pretty much every single one of their skulls in multiple places. It seemed as though Doris Dawson had been the first of all 4 of them to be killed, and she was killed in her bed, possibly even still sleeping. And it also seemed as though she had been the only one home when she was killed. So maybe she was killed and the murderer stayed in the house and waited for Mandy and the children to return. And the reason we know this, the reason we know that Doris was killed first and she was probably home alone, is due to 1 or 2 pieces of evidence that are quite confusing to explain. The sequence of events is kind of confusing, so stick with me as best as you can. I'll try my best. So like I said, Doris Dawson was murdered in her own bed. It's believed that she was possibly even asleep. So as the killer swung the murder weapon up into the air to hit Doris, they actually hit the light bulb, which was hanging on the ceiling behind them, and this blew a fuse and blew out the electrics in the whole house. Of course, the killer couldn't have that. If they were going to try to murder 3 other people in this same house, they couldn't do it in complete darkness. They were going to have to do something about this. So once they had finished beating Doris Dawson was now dead, they decided to try to fix the fuse. The killer went into Katie and Emily's bedroom, and in there the girls had a TV set on top of a chair. And so the killer took the TV, put it on the bed so it was out of the way so that they could get to the chair. They grabbed the chair and carried it downstairs to the downstairs bathroom, which was where the fuse box was. The killer then stood on the chair, got to the fuse box, fixed the fuse, and switched all the lights back on in the house. Now this tells us a few things. 1, the killer had enough time between the murder of Doris Dawson and the 3 other murders to be able to go and get a chair, carry it downstairs, fix a fuse box. 2, the killer knew where the fuse box was in this home, so perhaps they'd been there before. Maybe this was someone that the family knew. And 3, the chair that was taken downstairs to fix the fuse box with had no blood on it. However, the TV set in Katie and Emily's bedroom had blood spatter all over it. Now this means that Emily's murder, the younger of the 2 girls, which happened in her own bedroom, must have happened once the chair and the TV were already moved. If she would have been killed first, the blood spatter would be all over the chair and the TV. But since it was just on the TV, the chair had already been moved before she was killed. So that was an interesting piece of information for police to know very early on, because now they know that the killer had premeditated all of these murders. They'd waited for Mandy and the children specifically for some reason. Mandy Power had been beaten the worst of all the victims, with almost 40 injuries to her whole body. She seemed to be the main focus of the attack. Her skull had been broken into 10 separate pieces, and it seemed as though she'd been strangled at some point during the attack, although it wasn't with enough force to kill her or even render her unconscious. It was just, part of the physical attack. She'd actually been hit in the head so severely that one of her teeth had come out and was later found on the floor. She had clear self-defense wounds all over her arms and hands, so it was obvious that Mandy had fought for her life. She'd really put up a fight against her attacker. And like I said, she had been sexually assaulted. Her body was found naked and with a sex toy still inside of her. And it was believed that this sex toy had been inserted into Mandy's body either when she was unconscious or perhaps already dead, with pathologists leaning more towards the latter, that she was already dead. Something to note here as well was there was actually no semen on or in Mandy's body at all, and there was no tearing or ripping or damage to her genitals, so it didn't seem as though she'd been raped or that her attacker had attempted rape, of course, other than with this sex toy. One thing that did seem off about Mandy's body was that she was actually found with a silver men's wristwatch on her wrist, and Mandy wasn't one to wear men's things. You know how some girls like to wear men's clothes? I'm one of them. A lot of my wardrobe, a lot of my jewellery, a lot of, you know, how I express myself in terms of clothing is men's, but a lot of women aren't like that. A lot of women are very feminine, just like Mandy. Everything she owned was made for women, you know? She wasn't one to just wear a random piece of men's jewellery, and none of her friends really recognised this watch as hers. So had this been her killer's watch? Why? How was it on Mandy's body? How did it end up there? Why did it end up there? It appeared that the attack on Mandy Power had begun in her own bedroom and spanned across multiple different rooms. She was running away from her attacker, possibly going to find a weapon, going to protect her family. From the pattern of blood drops on the floor, so pathologists are so talented. There's such a science to this kind of stuff. They can see by the shape of the blood drop if the victim was moving or how fast they were moving, what direction they were moving. And they could see when and where Mandy went during this attack. So it began in her own bedroom, and then she ran to Katie and Emily's bedroom. And from there, she ran to her mother's bedroom, which is actually where the attack ended. Mandy's body was found in there, and you can tell from the blood drops because when they hit the ground, they made like a circular pool, which means they were just dropping vertically. They weren't dropping diagonally as if she was running. And there was actually a wound in Mandy's head, kind of a cross shape, that corresponded with a pattern on her mother Doris's set of drawers in her bedroom. So Mandy was still being attacked when she got into that room. Maybe her attacker had pushed her onto the drawers, hit her head on the drawers, or maybe even Mandy was so weak at this point because she was so injured, she'd lost so much blood, that maybe she fell onto these drawers kind of head first. But even then, the attack continued. It even continued after Mandy had already passed away on the floor of Doris's bedroom. Her attacker just continued hitting her. As for the young girls, the two daughters, Emily was found in the girls' bedroom. She was the younger of the two girls, 8 years old, and Katie, 10 years old, was found on the landing. Both of them had been beaten so badly that parts of their skull were later found on the ground. Emily was found with several of her teeth missing, which were later found on her bedroom floor. And from her injuries as well, you could tell that she was also beaten a few times after she was already dead. Emily was actually found partially undressed. However, crime scene investigators believe that she was probably getting changed when she was attacked because it didn't seem as though her clothes had been like forcibly removed and thrown on the floor or something. It did look like she was getting changed into her pajamas. Of course, you can't say for sure with things like that because we have no one to ask what was actually going on at that point, but nothing had happened to Emily. There was no sexual assault or anything like that. And 10-year-old Katie, who was found out on the landing, had been beaten so badly that her brain was exposed from her skull and had actually been poked with the murder weapon multiple times. It seemed as though Katie was the last of the four to die because the murder weapon was found with mainly her blood on it, and with the placement of her body, she was on the landing. It seemed as though maybe she'd been trying to run away. So now the crime scene search of 9 Kelvin Road began, and it was going to take 3 weeks, which is actually the longest ever crime scene investigation that Wales had ever had at that time. Of course, they weren't just searching that one home. They were searching the gardens, they were searching the street, they were searching the whole area around it, the drains outside. They were lifting up manhole covers, they were searching neighbours' gardens, just in case a murder weapon or any piece of evidence, anything from the crime scene had been ditched or hidden or discarded by the killer. Inside the house, investigators discovered that the house fire, had actually been a combination of 4 separate fires throughout the house, and they hadn't actually all been lit at the same time. The first fire was lit in Doris Dawson's bedroom around 2:30 a.m. However, the 4th fire, the last fire, was lit an hour and a half later at 4 a.m. and that was the one in the kitchen, the one that caused the most damage. Maybe the killer was watching the fire from a distance, making sure that the house lit on fire, and when the first one was taking too long, they returned to the house and lit the other 3 to speed up the process. Police found inside the house what they believed to have been the murder weapon. It was pretty burnt at this point. It was a large 4-foot pole with like a pointed end that had blood still on it. However, it was a lot lighter than they expected it to be. Like I said, they expected it to be a very heavy pole because of the damage that it had done. So it seemed as though for the killer to have done this much damage with such a light object, they must have had a lot of strength. They must have been using it very, very hard. Investigators saw that a few of the rooms in the house had blood spatter all up the walls, all on the ceiling. And in the upstairs bathroom, the bath had actually been half filled with water, and that had blood in it too. Although what's interesting was that there was no blood spatter inside the bathroom, so it didn't seem as though that had been a location in the attack. It didn't seem as though anyone had been attacked or hit in there. Perhaps the blood had gotten into the bath from maybe the killer washing it off themselves. Maybe the killer got into the shower or ran a bit of a bath and washed the blood from themselves before they left the crime scene. And this would explain why the bath was half full and mixed with water. Maybe the plug was in the bath and they had a bit of a shower and then got straight out. Also in the house, police found Mandy's mobile phone, and it was very badly burnt. It was unusable. However, this meant that police could contact Mandy's phone network and ask them if there'd been any calls or texts or anything that day running up to the murders, anything suspicious. But there hadn't been. There wasn't really anything of interest on Mandy's phone. Because Mandy had been sexually assaulted, the whole home was sprayed with a chemical, kind of like luminol that shows up where blood has been, but this chemical was for semen. It showed up where semen had been, and there was absolutely none in the whole home. Some sources say that there were a couple of deliberately burned pictures of the 2 daughters, Katie and Emily. It seemed as though the killer had burnt these pictures on purpose, although I don't know how accurate that is, since the whole home was on fire and the fire was so bad that it burnt pretty much everything there. I don't know how investigators would be able to tell if something was deliberately burnt. However, something interesting about this crime scene was that there was a white sports sock found very close to where Mandy and Doris's bodies were found. And this white sock was covered in blood, and fibres from this white sock were found all over the house, on the murder weapon, on the bodies, so it seemed as though the killer had used this sock as a glove so that they wouldn't get fingerprints anywhere, which shows that this crime was very planned, very premeditated. One rather standout piece of evidence that police found in 9 Kelvin Road was a broken men's chain, like a necklace, a 20-inch 9-carat gold chain with a broken clasp covered in blood. And this chain was very unique. It couldn't be just anyone's. Like I said, it had a broken clasp, but on this broken clasp, the owner of the chain had like attached some kind of makeshift silver loop, and this was a gold chain. So that was a very standout piece. And it also had some white paint on it. So maybe the owner of this chain had been a decorator, or maybe they'd just been painting their own home and got paint on their necklace. Whatever the circumstances, this was a very unique chain, and this was police's only really piece of evidence to identify a killer or a suspect. And so they really clung to this piece of evidence in this case. Other than that though, there really wasn't much else that investigators could take from the crime scene. That was one of the only pieces of evidence they really had, because everything was so badly burned. Police in this case later berated the firefighters that put out the fire at 9 Kelvin Road for trampling over and contaminating all this potential evidence in the house, which isn't exactly fair. The firefighters were just doing their jobs. They were called to put out a house fire, and that's all they thought this was. How were firefighters supposed to know that the victims inside that house were already dead? They were just doing their jobs. They were trying to put out that fire, get these people out and potentially save their lives. So yes, they probably did affect a bit of evidence in the home, but that can't really be helped. In retrospect, they were doing the best they could. They were trying to save lives. So at this point in the case, we're still on the morning that the bodies were found, and police are still at 9 Kelvin Road, and all the neighbours are still outside and whatever, and police are doing very quick, brief questionings of everyone just to see their connection to the family, just to help them get an idea of what might have gone on. The family's opposite neighbour was named Robert Wachowski, and he was the first one to call the police on that night. He woke up in the middle of the night around 4:30 in the morning after hearing banging and smashing noises outside. At first, he thought maybe it was someone trying to steal a car or break into a house or something, so he went straight to the window to see what was going on. But then across the street, he saw smoke coming out of 9 Kelvin Road. So he ran and grabbed his phone and called Mandy Power's mobile number to see if she was in, or if he could wake her up or something. But she didn't answer. And so he called the landline, and still there was no answer from Mandy. And so he did the only thing he really could do. He put on his dressing gown, put on his slippers, ran out into the street and began banging on Mandy's door, shouting to try to wake her up. Meanwhile, another neighbour on the road had woken up from all of this commotion, and he'd also ran outside. The two men ran round to the back of the house, and when they saw how bad the fire was in the kitchen, they tried to smash the door in, and when they did, they were hit by all of this heat, all of this smoke. They were going to try and go in and save them themselves, but they realised that this was just way too dangerous. They couldn't risk going in there and, losing their own lives. At this point, the fire department had already been called. Wachowski had called them himself before he'd left the house, and a few other neighbours, when they'd realised what was going on, they'd also called. Within hours of the fire department, paramedics, police arriving at the scene and the family being pronounced dead, Mandy Power's ex-husband, Michael Power, Katie and Emily's father, had been informed of the murders. He'd literally just arrived at his bakery that morning where he worked, and police met him there and told him, and as I'm sure you can imagine, he was distraught. He was so broken that he couldn't speak publicly on the murders for 2 months after they happened, no matter how much he wanted to. He wanted to do public appeals to try to find a killer. He wanted to go on TV and, talk about how amazing his daughters and his ex-wife was, but he couldn't. He just couldn't do it. He did what he could to help police in their investigation. He did all of his questionings, no matter how hard it was for him, but he just didn't do anything public with the media, no appeals or anything. He told police that he couldn't really think of anyone that might want to do this to Mandy or her children or Doris. I mean, police were mainly looking at someone in Mandy's life, someone Mandy knew, since she seemed to be the main focus of the attack. In fact, everyone else police asked said the same thing, that none of them had any enemies. There was no one that might want to hurt Mandy, no one that disliked Mandy. The family were just so likeable and easy to get on with, so who did this and why? It really did seem as though the family was specifically targeted for this. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nothing was stolen. It seemed so personal. There was sexual assault involved. All of their skulls had been caved in. This was evil, this was personal, this was brutal. After speaking with the victims' friends and family, police couldn't really find any suspects to look into. They had no names, they had no one. And so they began drafting up a list of potential people of interest, pretty much just based on association to the family. Of course, current partners, ex-partners, love interests are very much one to look at in cases like this. And of course, that included Michael Power, Mandy's ex-husband, the father of the two girls. However, he was ruled out pretty quickly. He had an alibi. He was at home sleeping with his girlfriend at the time. His girlfriend could say that he was home all night. They lived a fair few miles away from Clydach, and being asleep at the time of a murder isn't exactly a confirmed alibi, especially because your new girlfriend could lie for you, but there was also no motive here, so it just didn't seem likely. He wasn't a jealous ex. He left her. He left Mandy. He'd moved on. He had a new girlfriend, so there wasn't any resentment there. There wasn't any reason for him to want to do that. And he seemed to really adore his girls, his daughters. He was absolutely heartbroken. Like I said, he couldn't publicly speak on this for 2 months, and he really respected Mandy. They got on really well after the divorce. They were really good at parenting the two girls even after the split. It didn't seem like it was him, and police just could tell it wasn't him. Of course, he couldn't be 100% ruled out because his alibi couldn't 100% be confirmed, and he'd also been one of the last people to see the family before they were murdered. Katie and Emily had actually been over to his new house with his new girlfriend to stay over the night before, and Mandy had come to pick them up the next morning, so he'd seen all 3 of them on the morning of their murders. Of course, there's always the possibility that something could have gone on there could have been an argument, something might have happened with the girls the night before, but like I said, this suspect theory is mainly just by default because of his relationship to all of the victims. He was an ex-partner, so he has to kind of be looked into, but police just didn't think it was Michael Power. They had no real reason to suspect him. In the days following the murders, the outside of 9 Kelvin Road was covered in remembrance gestures for the family. There were flowers, there were letters, there were cards, there were stuffed animals left out for the young girls. People that didn't even know the victims were still going and leaving something because everyone in that area was just so affected by this. Like I said, people could relate. This could be their sister, it could be their mother, it could be their children. It was so heartbreaking for everyone that knew them or knew of them. It was just so heartbreaking for the area. Everyone was going to leave something, and these gifts outside the house was spilling out onto the road. Investigators had to literally step over all of these things to make their way into the house during this 3-week investigation. All of these things outside were also investigated by themselves because a lot of times murderers, because they are so sick and twisted, they like to kind of revel in their crimes, and there was always the possibility that the killer might have left their own letter or card or something. So everything was investigated, but nothing really came of that. And by the time the funerals of the family came around, they had such a huge turnout. Thousands of people lined the streets in that area as the funeral cars were going to the church. Everyone in that area just felt the same pain as the victims' families. Everyone in Clydach was grieving this family. But the police investigation continued on, and a lot of other people were questioned, mainly Mandy's flings. So when she divorced her husband, she had a lot of just flings because she'd been married since her early 20s. She was just kind of getting back out into the dating game, and all of these men were questioned. A fair few of these men that Mandy had been seeing at one point or another had been married, and so it was a route of interest to police because maybe these men were trying to cover up their infidelity, maybe their wives had found out and done this out of jealousy. You know, there's a motive there. Even the men that weren't married were questioned because maybe they didn't like that Mandy had moved on, maybe they didn't like how the relationship ended. However, police didn't find anyone too suspicious in that line of inquiry. Almost a year and a half went by and there were no major developments in this case. The team were really struggling with the lack of leads in this case because, of course, the whole crime scene pretty much had been burnt to the ground, so there was not much to go off, and they were very much relying on public appeals and people coming forward. And these appeals very much focused on that men's gold chain that was found in the home, hoping that maybe someone saw it and recognised it as someone they knew, a chain from someone that they knew that they wore all the time, you know? It was shown on every news station, Crime Watch, it was in the newspapers, hoping that maybe someone recognised it. Police thought it would be easy to identify this chain because it was so unique. The broken clasp, the replacement of a clasp, the paint on it, it was so unique. This was clearly not something that multiple people had. But for a full year and a half, no one was coming forward to claim this chain, and it looked like it was going to be another dead end in this case. That was finally, until a year and a half in, one man was identified. A man had called police after seeing one of these TV appeals to tell them that he recognised that chain and he thought it was his cousin's. His cousin was named David George Morris, sometimes known as Di Morris. The man calling the police said that he'd spoken with his cousin, David Morris, recently, And Morris had expressed to him that he was anxious about getting caught up in this case because he knows that he left his chain at Mandy Power's home. He said that he'd been having an affair with Mandy Power at the time of her murder, and he'd actually left his chain round at her house by accident the last time he'd been over, which was actually the day of her murder. So as soon as police heard this, they went and arrested David Morris and took him to the police station as they investigated this lead further. When police questioned him about this chain, he actually denied that it was his, but then later on in the case, he went back on that and admitted that it was his chain and that his cousin was correct and that he left it at Mandy's house after sleeping with her one night, which already looks a little bit suspicious. You know, why did he lie about that being his chain and then later go back on his word? So police were suspicious of this man for multiple reasons. So they decided to run David Morris's name on the database to see what kind of man they were dealing with. Was this a previous criminal? Had he done anything violent in the past? And they found that this man, David Morris, had quite an extensive criminal history, dating back all the way to when he was 14 years old. And many of these convictions, many of these charges were for rather violent things: street fights, drugs, robberies. He'd actually been done for assault at a funeral as well. He'd done 5 years for a huge house burglary. There were a number of driving offences as well, and then he continued to drive after those driving offences, so he got even more driving offences. Morris just had a reputation as a rather violent, aggressive man, and he was no stranger to prison time and police and being charged for different things. David Morris was 38 years old. He was a scrap metal dealer and a father to 3 young girls, and he was actually known to be a very good father to them, although the same thing can't be said for his ex-partners. David Morris had actually been married once before, however he was divorced at this point in his life. His wife had left him after enduring a full relationship of domestic violence. And at the time of his arrest, he actually had a new girlfriend, a long-term girlfriend that coincidentally happened to be called Mandy, who he was cheating on with Mandy Power. And this new relationship with his new girlfriend seemed to be taking a very similar route to that of his ex-wife. It was becoming violent. It was becoming abusive. Neighbours had witnessed David Morris screaming at his girlfriend, one time even hitting her with a shovel in the garden. The neighbours came over to try to break this up and defend this woman, but when they did, David Morris only turned on them and threatened them. On the night of the murders, David Morris had been at the local pub. He was drinking and taking drugs with his girlfriend and all of his friends. At one point in the night, as he often did, he got into yet another argument with his girlfriend, and this was getting very aggressive. I think it was actually about Mandy Power. Either way, no matter what it was about, his girlfriend got so upset from this argument that she just got up and left the pub and left David there with all of his friends. He stayed there for a while at that pub once his girlfriend had already left, and people that were also there said that he was just getting angrier and angrier as the night was going on, and then around 11 p.m, he told his friends that he was going to leave to go to Mandy Power's house and have sex with her. Now, this version of events that I'm about to say is just theory. This is not the official version of events. This is what police think happened that night. So David Morris left the pub around 11:30 p.m. and it's believed he began walking to Mandy Power's home. He arrived there in the early hours of the morning and demanded that Mandy had sex with him, and she refused. And if that's true, police think that David didn't like that, and so in his drunken, intoxicated state, because he was also on drugs that night, they think that he stormed inside the house and murdered Mandy and all of her family. And they think it was in the process of this, because Mandy had a lot of self-defense wounds on her arms, that maybe she'd reached up and grabbed David Morris's chain off of his neck and pulled it off in the attack. David Morris did give police an alibi, but it couldn't be confirmed. He said that he did leave the pub around 11:30 p.m. that night, but he began walking to his mother's house. He was going to stay at his mother's house, but it began raining, and his mother's house was a fair few miles away from the pub. So he began walking, it started raining, he didn't want to walk the full way, so he turned around and walked back to his own flat, where he got back in the early hours of the morning. One thing that kind of goes against David Morris being the killer was that crime scene investigators believe that whoever did this must have been sober. You know, David Morris was way too drunk, way too intoxicated, he was on drugs. He couldn't have perfectly planned out and carried out this murder. You know, even putting a sock over his hand to hide the fingerprints and washing all the blood from himself. They just think that he wouldn't have been in such a sound mind to be able to carry out this crime so well. It just seemed way too calculated, way too premeditated, but also the crime scene was so well cleaned up afterwards, and the fires were very carefully planned. You know, this didn't seem like a spur-of-the-moment attack out of anger. But despite the discrepancy between the theory of events and, you know, this actual evidence, these facts from the crime scene investigators, David Morris was put on trial and found guilty of the Clydach murders. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 32 years. However, David Morris, his whole family, and pretty much the whole community of Clydach believe that he is innocent.
We are devastated by the verdict. We are told by David's lawyers that there are good grounds for an appeal, which will be commenced straight away. We are confident that justice will prevail.
And I'm sure that you can tell from the fact that this is a two-parter that this isn't the end of the story. There's way more to this case than what meets the eye. Now, the South Wales police, who carried out this whole investigation that investigated the Clydach murders, are renowned for being corrupt and convicting the wrong people of crimes. They're actually responsible for some of the worst miscarriages of justice in the whole of the UK. A lot of them came out of South Wales. Officers have been accused of bullying and manipulating suspects or people of interest into giving false confessions. They've been suspected of writing confessions and getting suspects to sign it as though it's their confession. There's one specific example that sticks in my mind, and I can't remember if this was actually proven to be true or if this was just, you know, an alleged incident that happened with the South Wales police. But apparently one officer actually handcuffed a man to a hot radiator, until he confessed to a crime, which sounds like a form of mild torture to me. They've been accused of fabricating evidence, fabricating statements and quotes, incriminating quotes, planting false evidence to frame people, bribing people into giving false witness statements. Their notebooks and records of certain things would go missing or get damaged, or, you know, there was just a lot of suspicious, shady stuff going on with the South Wales police. I don't know if it's still like that, but it definitely was at this time. By the time of the Clydach murders, this kind of thing had happened in over 9 different murder cases, leading to 19 wrongful convictions of innocent people that were later freed. 19! And when you think about the severity of this, okay, so thank God the UK no longer has capital punishment, the death penalty, because how many of those 19 people would have been executed for a crime that they didn't even commit? A woman named Annette Hewins, a pregnant woman, and her friend Donna Clark were wrongfully convicted of the murders of 2 little girls and their mother in a house fire. I don't know exactly what the evidence was for Annette and Donna being the killers, but there was so much obvious evidence against them being the killers, like to say that they weren't the killers. For example, there was an eyewitness at the scene that day who had seen an older white man running away from the scene. Now, that doesn't sound like a pregnant woman and her friend, but police didn't take that into account at all, and the 2 women were sentenced to life in prison. And like I said, Annette was pregnant at the time, and so she gave birth in prison. She wasn't given the proper care to be able to, you know, give birth properly. They left it until the very last minute because they didn't want her having time out of prison. They left it until the very last minute, so she eventually ended up giving birth in the ambulance on the side of a roundabout because they couldn't make it to prison in time. Because they couldn't make it to the hospital in time. The prison guards hadn't let her leave the prison to make it to the hospital in time to give birth. The two women spent almost 3 years in prison before they were finally exonerated and freed because they were innocent. They didn't do this. And Annette missed out on 2.5 years of her son's life. And, you know, this whole thing is serious enough as it is. It should have never happened, but a baby's first few years of their life are the most important. The things that they learn and experience at that age will stick with them and affect them all the way through their life. And if their parent isn't there, and if they're going through that kind of thing, this baby's whole life was potentially affected, their future relationships, their mental health for the rest of their life, because police just rushed to convict the wrong person. They just wanted a conviction and they put this child's mother in prison when she was innocent. Another notorious case where an eyewitness testimony was completely disregarded was the murder of Lynette White. She was a sex worker that had been murdered in her own flat. She was stabbed so many times, and a white man had been seen fleeing the scene once again. But somehow, the homicide team ended up arresting 5 non-white men. There was absolutely no physical evidence putting these men at the scene. I don't think they even knew Lynette White or had connections to her or that area or, you know, anyone in her work. 3 of those 5 men were convicted and they are now known as the Cardiff Three. They were finally exonerated after 2 years in jail after their family and the whole of their area tirelessly campaigned for their release because they were innocent. As a result of these unfair and corrupt practices, a lot of police officers were suspended, but they never faced any kind of criminal charges. They just lost their job. So it's believable that based on their track record, maybe David Morris was innocent. Maybe police had just rushed to make a conviction. It had been 1.5 years since the Clydach murders and they were looking like they couldn't do their job. They were looking like they couldn't find a killer, and maybe they found the smallest connection between David Morris and Mandy Power, that chain, and they ran with it and they convicted the wrong man. So in part 2, we will explore some potentially fabricated evidence from the police, as well as some real evidence that police conveniently decided to skip over. And there are some very suspicious looking people with some high up connections that could have potentially covered up their involvement in the Clydach murders. So yeah, I'll be back in a couple of days for part 2. Make sure you've got my notifications on if you don't want to miss that. Thanks again to Audible for sponsoring this video. This has really been a sponsorship come true. If you want to get 1 audiobook plus unlimited Audible originals for free when you try Audible for 30 days, then you can just go through my link, which is audible.com/Eleanor. It's in the description below, or you can text Eleanor to 500 500. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for helping me decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can just click the join button on a desktop, or there'll be a link in the description of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe to this channel, you can click this circle right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, you can click this circle. Or if you want to watch another one of my videos, there'll be a playlist on screen right now. Bye!